Okay,
So,
everyone, I think we are ready to get underway. We are very excited to start our day and our conference off with a plenary talk from Nyalleng Moorosi. She has done a tremendous amount of work that is squarely in the bounds of emo and its mission, its history. She's been a software engineer at Google. She's worked with the South African Council for Scientific and Industrial Research and is currently a research fellow at the Distributed AI Research Institute. Her work, both academic and through organizations like the Deep Learning Indaba and the A Plus Alliance, has worked to democratize AI, to identify and reduce its harms, and to grow the global community who engage with these tools. And so these are exactly in line with the goals and the themes of this conference and our research community. And we're very excited to have her join us remotely today from South Africa. And so let's all hear what she has to say. We're going to do an hour with no questions. We'll do questions at the end, partly to keep time, partly just because of the Zoom technology. But when we conclude, I'll come and moderate, and we can engage in a discussion afterwards. Thank you very much.
all right, thank you.
Oh,
Um,
and we cannot see the slides.
Fabulous. Okay, thank you all for inviting me today to come and talk. I do, I do wish I could be here with you. I wish I could be there with you, so that we can actually have this conversation and then I have some conversations after. So I've titled this talk From Their Imagination to Ours. And the reason why I put in the word imagination is because a lot of my work has been building around, of course, here in Africa, but in general around the areas of how do you build machine learning systems with limited data? Both the evaluation aspects of it, but also how do we actually go ahead and build it? How do you optimize data collection and all of that? So I'm grateful for the introduction that was given. So a lot of the work, some of the work I'm going to share is from the distributed AI research. Some of the work I started doing when I was at the South African Research Lab, the CSIR. And some is just work that has just popped up as time has been going on. But an important thing about us at the distributed AI research is that we emphasize that our work has got to be done in context with the people for whom we build. So as close as possible to the people we build. Um, and this is probably informed by the fairness work that many of us came from. We understand that when there is a bit of a distance between the technology builder and the people for whom we're building, sometimes we run into issues. I have started to think about these issues as issues of prioritization. All right, so I've spent quite a bit of time recently just thinking about what changes when we build within our own community. So this is beyond what happens when you consult a community. This is literally, I'm from Lesotho, I'm living here in South Africa. What changes when I build for people in Lesotho? What changes when I build for Basotho? And what changes when I build for South Africa? This was not necessarily a thing that came to the fore. It is something that happened after just building in different spaces. For example, building inside Google, which is optimized for the average, like definitely optimized for the US and then, Western Europe. But overall, it's trying to capture as many people as possible. And then building for the South African government, which had a mandate that was specific and was for the people. And then, of course, inside, the startup, which is the distributed AI research, all of these things, I realized that there's a difference in how we build. And I started to ruminate over this. For us here in Africa, there is approximately $3.6 billion that has been raised in VC funds for AI in Africa. And this is in contrast with, for example, last year, the four Google, Microsoft, Amazon, and Meta, they spent 400 billion to build AI. So we come at this very much rejecting the idea that you have to have a lot of funds in order to build usable AI. Especially because for us here in Africa, we know very many of those products that have been built and are really not functional here. And I'm speaking about, for example, language models that have been built. And I'll go into a little bit about that. So language models that we know do not and cannot work over our languages, many of the African languages. For example, when you're talking about products that are built in computer vision, let's say disease diagnostics, like dermatological disease diagnostics. This has been like an ongoing thing that has been an issue. And importantly, when you live in Africa, the idea is that many of the way these topics are talked about, like when we talk about like in the West, right? Like a lot of this is about the marginal people, right? It's like not the real core. It's like these are issues of fairness and issues of inclusion. But for us, they're actually not issues of inclusion. They are actually issues of functionality. Like if it doesn't, this is the majority population for which you have to work. And you'll see that a lot of what I talk about is instead of thinking of how do we augment the data sets that already exist, I think about how do we build locally. Just because a lot of like the starting point matters for the people who are familiar with language technology. You know that the language that you start off with matters in terms of how then you will perform with the other languages, which is exactly why English, like a lot of these models perform so well in English. So I was thinking about this idea when I came to this thing that, okay, actually, we do not need to be thinking about adding more of our data sets into the larger machinery because there's more than data. There is this expertise. And so many people that I talked to, including myself, when I started to build the system, which I'm going to talk about a little bit. But so many times we do what we know works because we understand the context for which we build. We do not systematically evaluate why. We do not do the scientific methodology of why this works. And so I started to think about what is the scientific methodology about, how can we think about this as a true input of expertise into these systems and not just, like I said, a matter of inclusion or things like, oh, let's just be nice and make sure everybody's taken care of. This goes to the core of what is functional and usable around here. So if we think about like language as an example, right? With online, many of these systems are built with scraping language online, right? And this is the distribution of languages that are available online, right? This is not necessarily when you go out and you find the data set and you curate the data set, but this is the representation of the amount of languages that are and the quantity of the languages that are there online with, for example, English being up to 50%. For us, we would talk about this as a long tail distribution, which of course is a term we borrowed from commerce, but this is a long tail distribution. And for the people who do machine learning and long tail learning, the complications of this kind of data distribution. And some of those, of course, you start from the imbalance of it. Then you have the problem of there's too little to even understand like the class boundaries of this. And then it's very easy to stereotype because you have got entities being represented by very few instances. Error is a huge problem here because you only have such few instances that even if you have little error, the ratio of error to truth is so high. So this is a complicated place to build. And so many times, I personally do not think that we need to be thinking about building for these people at the end, including, of course, like African languages in this format where we regard it as a long tail. But instead, I think we ought to like chop it up into these pieces. So, and this goes to the thing of maybe people ought to build for their specific languages. And there's benefits to that I'm going to talk to. All right, so that was the online data, but this is actually like by the latest estimates, right, of what the world looks like with all of the languages. Look, for example, here in Africa, there's estimates of up to 3,000 different languages um, that are spoken locally, that are native to the people, that are home languages and languages of their thought and storytelling and history. So this is the world, this is the world as it exists versus the world as the internet sees it. And I, for one, of course, for building this world in this way, in the way that actually represent the plurality of the people who use these technologies. So we at the distributed AI research, one of the things we think about is what gets lost if we do not actually optimize for these populations that there is not as much an incentive from the big tech companies to build for, right? There's not as much of a market incentive, but there is a big ethical incentive for building that. And for some people, there's cultural and there's safety related to this. So at the distributed AI research, one of the projects that are ongoing is documenting social media harms. And this project was born out of, there's a couple of individuals inside the group who do come from the Horn of Africa. And their observation was that the systems that are built in tech companies, in the larger tech companies, are incapable of detecting harmful language. And because they're incapable of this, we are seeing this genocide that is playing out on social media. So this is the core of this project. And once again, I have to go back and say, this once again is all about the importance of having the people who understand the costs of neglecting, of not doing something, of not building specific technology in a specific way, or of optimizing in a specific way. There is, of course, a lot of literature that goes into this. So the Center for Democracy and I forgot the T. Somebody, I know somebody will know this. I always just call it the CGT. But anyway, they did this lengthy report about what gets lost in translation and some of the areas, and this is an older report, this is like a 2022 report. But one of the specific areas that we're looking at are what gets lost in conflict areas, right? And focusing on that. And they focus on nuance, right? So if you do not understand the slang, right, of the language, how do you automate this process? So I think that this document gives, in general, the overarching problems of what gets lost in these multilingual models when we are trying to input too many languages and they're all like competing for resources. But more importantly, when the building of these languages is centralized in one place and it is not distributed and built in the places where the people actually understand the nuance and the context of this. But you can see also there's this project, there's a link here I've put for the distributed AI research project. It is a long running project that has many of our staff looking at it, exactly because we have realized that there is failure about all of these other language models. There is also the thing that I always is when we're thinking about priorities is that understanding the scope of the harm depends on the background of the person building this. When we build machine learning methods and when we get into their evaluation, we make so many decisions. All the people who work in fairness know that we infect the work of fairness in when we're building models, because fairness is broader. But in the places where we're fine-tuning models, the work of fairness is to embed our values into that model and sway it from where it was going to go and put it to a place that we believe is the right. So that means we choose both the magnitude of the error and the type of the error that we are willing to tolerate. Different people will tolerate different types of error. And in many of my conversations with some of the local builders, I have run into this. I have an example of this wonderful researcher who's been building for courts in Argentina. And she's this Ivana, and she has a startup of her own called Data Genero. And she has this thing of saying, I build for courts in Argentina. I understand Argentinian society. She's Argentinian. And so she was like, the first thing I'm building for is privacy, because I know the vulnerability of the people who have gone through and whose court records I'm processing. Because she works with like gender-based violence. And she was like, first and foremost, I build for privacy. This is a prioritization for her. And so many people are going to build for different types of people. And so this is a theme that I say, this is beyond just increasing the number of instances in a data set. I've actually talked a little bit about this because I've already mentioned some of the problems when we build this process of a long tail, right? With the imbalance, the not enough information, not understanding class distribution. And by the way, this stuff is really old. I mean, this stuff was being discussed in the 80s about what happens in these really, really small classes. When one of them was this idea that actually these small classes are compound classes, which for a machine learning model makes it very difficult to actually classify them. By compound, I mean, an example is like you take the Emmys. If you look at the class of music at the Emmys, there are so many differentiations when it comes to American music genres, right? And then you look at that, and then you see world music or like African music or Latin American music, right? And those within themselves, that's supposed to be a class, but it is such a compound class. So basically, this is the same idea that we have when we're building here. So we know already that our languages are on the tail of this distribution. And so the question is how do we augment, right? Like, how do we increase the information so that we can actually build the systems that we need to build? And I've got three three points to make about the data. First of all, sometimes the data is not missing. The people who are looking for the data do not understand how the data is annotated. They do not understand the language. They do not understand how people speak about phenomena. There is a paper that I've cited here from one of our colleagues, actually, Elaine, who's at Boston University. This is in 2020, so this is now it was published in 2021, but the research was ongoing in 2020, the height of COVID. She is an epidemiologist, so she is thinking about how do I track, right, respiratory illnesses in Cameroon. She's Cameroonian, and she wants to know, how do I utilize the methodology that I have developed while working at Boston University and doing the work inside the US in order to actually find how this pandemic is manifesting in Cameroon. And this study, there had been other people who had tried to do this study and they couldn't find any data. She knew how people communicated about respiratory diseases in Cameroon. And she went and she found the data and she did a model and she did the analysis. And then, she published this paper. So there was the data. It's just that people who did not come from the culture did not understand what the search term should be. So when she's looking, she's using is like searching on Google. If you don't know what the search term ought to be and what are the things and how people speak about specific phenomena, then it gets to be very difficult to find the data. The second part is to think about so you are starting from very little data and data is very expensive to curate, right? And so how do we find the most informative pieces of data? This is something that I learned from my colleague, Asmelash, who builds for Ethiopian and Eritrean languages. He builds models and this was this was an article about him that was posted in Rest of the World. But basically, I talked to him and he says to me, Nyalleng, all I found was that the names, one of the biggest problems was the names, that these models could not tell the difference between, like, could not perform name like recognition. So as a word and a name. And so what he did was he went out and he just collected a bunch of names and really fine-tuned on the names and make sure that the model could detect the names. That was just one of the things. The other thing that Asmelash does do with his company is that his data sets are built by people in Ethiopia and Eritrea who speaks both Amharic and Tigrinya. And because he understands the technology, he understands the language, he is able to figure out what are the missing pieces, what are the pieces of data that if I am to go and collect, is going to improve this the most. Um, and we kind of had the same thing. So the project I'm going to be talking about later on about how, and really it's really the source of this kind of thinking for me, because I was just simply looking at things and doing some research. Um, but basically, the idea that sometimes you have to go and find specific areas. This we have seen currently. There's a really wonderful data set I've been playing around with. This actually comes from in the US and it's a dermatology data set because I was interested in comparing like how do you measure, like is there a way to automate measuring this information, right? Because here on Asmela, she knows the language. It's kind of like an inbuilt thing, but how do you automate, how do you systematically do this? And so I was looking at diversity measurements in this, and you find this data set that was curated by dermatologists. There's only like a little over 600 instances, a little over 600 images, but that data set, if you use many of the diversity measurements that are around geometric diversity, the Venn combinatorial, you use these, it comes out more diverse than, for example, the data set on which they were improving, which had 10,000 instances. So we move from the idea of just the number of instances. It's not just about the number of the instances, it's about what the instances are. So this is the other thing. For example, here, Dr. Lini, and this is a latest data set about of voice data from that covers like Kenya and Nigeria, and it's in South Africa. There's where it covers multiple languages there, and they specifically decided that we want to make sure that we are including all of these. And perhaps given that she is Kenyan, there is something that she knows about how the language changes with age and regions and backgrounds and all of that. She's making sure that she covers all of these because she understands the problem. Now, the third thing is, all right, great. You found the data and you can see the data and you can comprehend the data. What to do with the data differs. So in 2017, I was still at the CSIR. And there was a lot of work on like computer vision, especially with satellite imagery. This work, a lot of it was and this was now being done in Africa. There'd been a lot of that, like building classification, and that was very poor. I remember there was this competition called Deep Globe. And like the one city that was there for Africa, I think there was Khartoum as one of the benchmark city, and there was like accuracy was like 40%, whereas it was 90% in like Vegas and other cities in the US. But anyway, so some other work that was happening was using night lights to estimate poverty, right? Or estimate wealth in Africa. And this was a lot of the work that was being done from outside Africa. And it was like using this technology to estimate. And that's great because we don't have a lot of sensors here in Africa. The only problem that, like, in my head, I was thinking this model is going to be so wrong in South Africa because in South Africa, some of the most brightly lit neighborhoods are the previous townships. These were highly policed neighborhoods in South Africa, and they're usually very low income. But because they were highly policed, they are one of the characteristics is really wide streets and very bright. This was the purpose. They were built to be very well lit at night so that they could be policed. And so you see, and I was thinking about this, and you see this sort of thing where we understand, we see things differently when you're sitting in the space versus when people are looking from a distance without understanding the context. And this model will hold in many places, but I was like in South Africa, especially South African cities, this will not hold. And then so finally, this was a thing. This when I was saying that we tinker with things. This is a project I did while I was still at Google, and this was about how can we optimize search so that we make sure that the results that we return are as diverse as possible. You don't have to look at, you don't have to worry about all of this, but this is the thing of it. And so, we did different models and then we did different aggregation. If you just do like a utilitarian, then you're just summing up, and egalitarian, then you're making sure that the least represented data appears as often as possible. and so on and so forth. And this was definitely us embedding our values into the entire system. And this was us saying, this is our priority. Our priority is that we want to make sure that the search results that are returned are diverse. And there is an article that was just running recently in Rest of the World to like 2 months ago, and I thought this comment really captures so much about what we think about many times when there is a push to collect more data set, especially when it comes from the larger tech companies, right? Because we know that we are underdocumented, and whomever gets the data is gonna be the person who's going to be able to build the product. This is this quote is from like one of the a researcher who has her own NGO in Kenya. And she was very much not fazed by this because there's also the predatory lens. There's also the predatory aspect to, oh, let's go get more data. Oh, let's get these people documented, right? Because the question is why? What are we doing with all of this? So I did not know if it should be the beginning or it should be somewhere here. Basically, this whole thing started in 2017 at the CSIR. So the CSIR is the government research lab I was at before I went to join Google. I was sitting in my office and I had a master student, and I've always been really fascinated by how South Africa was changing post-apartheid. So South Africa, one of the apartheid policies was to segregate people physically. Like these people have to live here and these people, and there has to be large areas in between. And and you could see it from the built environment. You could just see from the pictures that this neighborhood is this and this neighborhood is this. So obviously, this was a perfect computer vision project. Now, having having the some of my history from South Africa, but also just being a Black person existing in South Africa, I'd always been going to the township and always interested in the things about the township. But I'll talk to you about what a township is. But the real thing, the core of the problem ended up being, how do we characterize a township? Here's what we were trying to build. This is an ongoing project that we now have at the distributed AI. It has moved from the CSIR. It's been work that I've been doing with Raisecha, who was a master student at the time. Now she's a PhD student at Miller. And Team Need here at the Distributed AI Research. We started this from before. This is an image of South Africa. On one hand, you've got the suburb. On the other hand, you've got the township. Actually, on the other hand, you've got an informal settlements, not a township. And what we wanted to know was, how have neighborhoods changed since the end of apartheid? So apartheid ends in 1994. We are now well over 20 years past that. We're at the year 23. Have we seen a difference in the built environment in the country? So the first thing we did was that we decided that the labels that were provided were not suitable for us. And so we regenerated the ground truth. Because currently South Africa classifies neighborhood as such. You've got village and formal residential, informal farms, and so on. We wanted to split the formal residential class back into suburbs and townships. The reason we wanted to split this back up is because the lived life of South Africans is kind of like this, but also we were trying to track from the end of apartheid to now, and these were the neighborhoods back in the time of apartheid. But I think what was really interesting for us also here was that the government was not labeling it like that. It was not necessarily these labels did not exist in the first place. But we decided that we wanted to break these apart so that we can actually do that. And we felt that we could because we understood the context. So this is what I'm talking about. Now I don't have a pointer. But basically, there were all these buffer zones. So for example, the city center is here in the middle where like the railway runs. And you have this circular thing where you've got Closer to the city were like the whiter neighborhoods, and then outside you had the townships, and the township was where the labor lived. So we decided, after we actually wrote a paper, submitted this paper, but anyway, now what happened was, as we were doing this research, we were engaging with a lot of people, some of the reviewers who were telling us that actually we had done too much to the data for the data to still be objective. For example, our breaking apart neighborhoods, we had completely documented that. Of course, we had to, and like submitted all the code and all the data and all of that. But that was one of the things that was the issue. And interestingly, I don't think any one of us felt like that needed to be an issue. We did want to break the data in a way that we believed that actually expressed the world we lived in. So that data set has actually had great reception in both South Africa and abroad. But this year was 30 years, or last year, 2024, yeah. 2024 was 30 years since this. And so we wanted to see, all right, so we can visualize the neighborhoods. We can look at how many things there are. And so how many schools, how many hospitals, how many this. And we wanted to know, is there a way we can quantify health access in the country and compare it by neighborhood? So our question was, 30 years on, what is the state of health access in South Africa? And health is a big thing because health, like many things that are like primary needs of people, was used as an instrument of controlling people and where people can and cannot be. And when a hospital was built, was part of the policy of who we need to be keeping around and who we can let go of. But since the end of apartheid, there's a bill of rights that specifically say health access is a human right in South Africa. So actually going to a hospital is free in South Africa. Public hospital, I should say. So health is a human right in South Africa. And so the government has to provide access to all of South Africa. This year, they put in a bill, a national health insurance bill, to extend the access to all South Africans. And I'll tell you why. Because South Africa has a two-tier system, right? About 80% of South Africans are on the in public health. They use public services, and about 16% use private services. However, in the budgeting, 50% goes to public and 50% goes to private. So you have these institutions, you have these other hospitals that have much better facilities but serve fewer people, much fewer people. And 77% of white population utilizes the private health, and then 12% of Black people use it. So there are about four type of hospitals. Three of them are referral and specialization hospitals. And then, of course, we've got like the district. This is the primary care. This is the first area of contact between a person and the health services. The private, you can go for anything. And they have great facilities. So you can go for anything. You go for your kid for vaccines, but also you go for very serious surgeries. So the issue was the government is looking to say, how do we allocate? How do we allocate the resources that are in the private hospitals to augment the resources that are in the public sphere? And there are about three real players in this in the private market. So the things that we did was we looked at this problem, and there was a health task force that was sent out in 2019 to really explore this. What are the steps that the government would need to take in order to actually open up more institutions, more health access, health services to the people who currently use public health systems, which are overcrowded. And so one of the things that they defined access to was distance, right? It's finances and it's distance. So because we could do this, we don't know people's bank accounts, but we can measure distances now that we have divided our data sets according to neighborhoods, and we have specific understanding of our model can detect that, oh, this is an informal settlement, this is a township, this is a this, this is a that. So now we use the distances in order to measure what is health access in South Africa. So, for example, one of the things that we found was that villages and traditional residential areas are really far from the hospitals. This is nationwide. Now, sometimes this kind of thing can be like this is the kind of work that has been done in many other places. One of the things that makes it really special here also in South Africa is that South Africa, beyond being fragmented by race, it was fragmented geographically. This is the whole thing, divide and conquer, right? So it is not very normal to get to see a whole country view. These kinds of studies had been done, but many were done locally on a small scale. We wanted to see all township, all villages, all suburbs in the entire country about like what do the average person in these neighborhoods, what is their access to hospitals? Some are not surprising. For example, farms. Of course, farms are going to be in rural areas. Townships and suburbs are urban infrastructure, so they'll be closer to the hospitals. What's also interesting is also like the type of hospitals that they are going to be close to. Um, so the other thing we wanted to look at is the issue of overcrowding. And we see, for example, like in terms of like the district hospital, the very first point of contact in villages are the only, these are the far away, the traditional residential neighborhood. These are the only neighborhoods that are actually showing an overcrowding at this level, which is a problem because this means that maybe there ought to be some other clinics that are put because this is just this is just primary health. The other question we wanted to see was what about in cities? So we picked the most urban province in South Africa, which is Gauteng, and we looked at the townships there. And for example, if you can see, they are the most crowded with, for example, Beki Mlangeni being the most crowded. This is, I believe this one is in Soweto. Then we were looking at, all right, so the government wants people to be able to get to sometimes use the facilities at private hospitals. How practical is that for people in different neighborhoods, right? And so we looked at Gauteng as, like I said, the most urban, but also the Western Cape, which is the province where like Cape Town and other big cities are there. So we looked at here, and if you see, this is about how far from the next private hospital are you? And on average, people in the suburbs are pretty close to the hospitals. People in townships are close to some private hospitals, but not all of them. And then you see like the pattern all over. We wanted to concentrate on this difference between suburb and township and sometimes village, because these are the farms are just really, they're just really far, and it's very difficult to quantify the demographics on farms, but it's much easier to quantify the demographics in suburbs and townships and villages. And more importantly, these were the neighborhoods that were set up specifically by the apartheid government. So in our tracking, we want to see how things are going. The same thing we see, for example, in the Western Cape about this access to private hospital. What this means, of course, for what we hope to contribute to the national discussion, what this means is perhaps the private hospitals are not necessarily going to be the places that get opened up, for example, for things like primary health, right? Because for the people who do not live in suburbs, and these are people in suburbs are the wealthier people, and these are people who are already using the private hospitals. So the people for whom the government wants to open access to, these people are far on average from these hospitals. And so that is something to think about. Oh, then we were looking at the number of beds per these hospitals. In in public hospitals, we have got 2 million people sharing around 9,500 beds. In private hospitals, there's 8 million people for 7,400 beds. And this is, like I said, in the Gauteng region. And when we look at the number of beds for the central and the tertiary hospital, these are the hospitals that are for specialization. So if you like cancer treatment or any major surgery, these are the hospitals that you have to go to. The number of beds per 1,000 people. Many of these are way less than what is recommended, which is around 1.5 beds per 1,000 people. But some hospital, for example, like this one that I pointed to, which is located in the Western Cape, very close to the city of Cape Town, it has a very high number of beds. So for that, you start to see the disparity about where maybe there needs to be improvement. And these are just the other side, just looking specifically at surgical beds. And once again, we've got this disparity. For example, this one, the second one, which I should have highlighted, the Chris Hani Barawath. This one is the biggest hospital in South Africa, and it's located in Soweto. So this is the primary hospital for the biggest township in South Africa, and you can see the number of beds, the number of surgical beds. So there was an article, there was a push a couple of years back. The Chris Hani hospital lost its surgical ward, its cardiac surgical ward. And so now the doctors there and the other academics and researchers were motivating for why this needs to happen. Now, what we wanted, the interest here for us is to say, all right, now we know the layout of South Africa, but also we kind of have an estimate of the neighborhoods. And if we have an estimate of the neighborhoods, we also have an estimate of the population. So this is the kind of situation that plays out with these kinds of hospitals. At the very bottom here, the dot, this is the Chris Hani. The next one that's a bigger circle here with the black, still like the black dot, this is the Charlotte Maxeke. The people here at the bottom, when there is no cardiac surgery, they'd be referred to the next one over. That's the Charlotte Maxeke. It so happened that around the same time that Charlotte Maxeke's cardiac wing also was damaged, and I believe it's fire. It was fire damage. That meant this entire population that uses the public system has to go all the way up to the next city, which is Pretoria, which is approximately 80 kilometers away, in order to access these kinds of surgical services here at Steve Biko. But importantly, as everybody is migrating northwards, that means that this hospital up here gets even more crowded. But these hospitals that I've highlighted here in purple actually are private hospitals that offer this kind of surgery. So on the private, on the primary health, perhaps this is not meaningful, but on the referral part, right? This is now meaningful. This thing that the government wants to do is now meaningful. By the way, there's like, I believe like 8 million people there's a oh, I can't believe I actually forgot the population of this whole city. But basically, there is at least 10 million people in that whole area. And so for the people who are using the public health system, you're now referring this kind of population. This is where this kind of population looks to. But I've forgotten the breakup of like how much is in Soweto and how much is in Johannesburg and then how much is in Pretoria. So currently what we've got a whole bunch of outputs at the DAIR about this project. We have talked to the media. We talked because South Africa was recently in the news about the issue of land. So now we had the data set to be able to contribute to this conversation. We've got we've opened up this data set. We're now sharing it with research institutes. We're sharing it with the citizens. We have an academic collaboration. We actually started an academic collaboration with UPenn this year, where we're looking at access to pharmacy. And the lead here, well, the person's been doing a lot of work, researcher, recently won the Mozilla 25 just last year about this specific project. So I wanted to also just talk about this kind of project, about what it looks like and the kind of steps that happens when we hyper-localize. Because before this, like I said, we were not even able to classify neighborhoods. But now we can start to contribute to policy and actually do this is a computer vision work. But for example, one of the things that we knew that is very important that we were the one doing it. Townships are very tricky, especially now. Some townships look like suburbs, some townships look like informal settlements. But we knew there were specific things about townships that we knew. And one of the things that we did was we went out, we found more data just on townships. And specifically, we wanted to find the townships that had a lot of additional housing that gets built around the primary house. Remember, these are low income neighborhoods that are urban. So rent is a very lucrative deal. And actually now we have expanded this to analyzing greenery, analyzing what's the other one? Income disparity and all of this. So the project itself, we have like, it's grown. And an interesting thing is that township are the least green neighborhoods in South Africa. They are less green than commercial, like where like the downtowns, they are less green than those. And one of the reason is because any little piece of land that people have in township, they build a house because rent is what makes a living in these really low income neighborhoods. So I moved, so I just been thinking about this and ruminating about this. And I last year I decided to hold a craft session at FACT. And the session was about, I wanted to talk to fellow builders and together think about what is the thing that you know about your neighborhood that makes it so that you can build a product that is usable. That is where, for example, I got the story, and this was held in Rio. And so we had stories from Egypt. We had stories from New Zealand. People who are building for the Maori language technology. Who's like now Caleb is now a collaborator for this whole movement. Ivana was back again this year. It's a whole Nina Daora who was building language, who was surveillance technology in Rio. So it's now grown into this, and I just been very interested. What is the thing that you know about your community that allows you to build better? Because I think a lot of the time when we're thinking about building in low resources, we're thinking about the lack. But there's so much that people bring that they know that they can actually maneuver this whole thing and build workable systems. And so this has now been a revolving thing. Um, it's the effect. We took it to RightsCon. We were supposed to be at Mozilla, but unfortunately, I couldn't make it to go and talk, so we had to pull it there. And overall, we're seeing this community of builders. Inside there is the Hinuku Association that language builders are building. Kaya AI out of Ghana, Lesan in the Horn of Africa, Ghana NLP, Lilapa is in Southern Africa. We have consortiums of researchers, for example, the Afri LLD, and then of course the Deep Learning Indaba, which we came to, which we built in 2017, um, and uh, and so on one hand, along with all of this, the curiosity of how do we optimize what we already know and already have to build working products locally. One of the things has been to build the communities around us so that we can actually highlight the things we know, but then also be able to be bold enough to insert ourselves into these systems, because sometimes it can be intimidating. So this actually started really small while I was still at the CSIR with the D site. For us in South Africa, this is always a thing. We formed this institution D site and actually one of the people we're going to talk, we actually had a little crossover with when he was still at University of Chicago, Riyadh. We had with data science for society. Was that what it was called? But anyway, but we were decide we built it because we started to get contact from South African banks where they wanted to know, how do we how do we build models to be able to allocate loans? or all of the things, whatever the thing is that they're doing inside banking. One of the things was like they wanted to model like so that they do not lose customers. I forget what the term is for that, but basically the moment something like how do we automate the process of loans in South Africa, red flag. Because loans are based on assets, right? And the idea of who has an asset and who has the ability to pay in South Africa is tricky. One, there is a question about how people gained the assets that they do have. Second thing, the idea was that we do not want to go back and have the people who do not have the asset because we just came out of a fairly unfair governance system and then have those people not be able to access loans because they do not have a history. They do not have a credit history or they do not have, clear assets and all of that. So we set this up actually so that we could train ready to graduate undergrad, master students, and entry level PhD students on what exactly is this process of machine learning and what to look out for. Like, exactly, so that you know what it can and cannot do. From that, we then build the Deep Learning Indaba, which has become a really big thing. So with some of the people I was inside D-side with, we built the Deep Learning Indaba in 2017. We had our first one in Johannesburg. Now the next one is gonna be in Lagos. It's however many years old, almost 8 years old. We're been to Tunisia. It's a great way actually to see Africa. Just go to the next Deep Learning Indaba. It always hops all over the country, all over the continent. And now it's the biggest community of machine learning researchers in Africa. There's branches in many countries. The last time I checked, it was like 32 countries that we now have branches. And personally, the Deep Learning Indaba is something that I have walked away from, not like fully, but it's something that I know is in great hands, has great leaders. There's always new people coming in and taking over the leadership. Like it always changes who's leading the Indaba this year. And it's a wonderful thing that we have built. And now what I'm concentrating on is this whole community of building for the long tail, where we travel and we share this intelligence about how do we build for ourselves. Now, I want to close with this slide. This is what we also this came from DAIR, and I love this. And of course, I wrote a little thing called a possible future article, and they did this graphic with this traditional Basutu blanket, which I absolutely love, and the hat. And then, but anyway, besides this, the task is can we imagine a different technological future than the future we're currently looking at, where we are talking about, is AI going to take over the world? Is AI useless? Is this, is that, is this? Because I'm inside all that hype and all that noise. There are so many systems that this form of computing can help in, so many problems that this form of computing can improve on, can solve, but we don't always hear. And this is our push to ask people to imagine their own possible technological future. What could technology do for them? I'll give you an example. It's not even mine. I have mine, but this one came from one of our co-researcher who's a journalist. So we have a diversity of people like come from different backgrounds. Her thing, she's a journalist. She also was a refugee from Eritrea a long time ago, in the 90s. And she as a researcher, as a journalist, her name is Meron, and she still works on the plight of the many African refugees trying to cross over to Europe, and what happens to them, in North Africa, what happens to them in Europe, and so on and so forth. And her thing is many times she gets the call from parents who do not know what happens to their kid. And she knows that for example, there are countries that keep the DNA. This is very sad, but it's very useful. The DNA of the deceased people, the people who deceased in the Mediterranean trying to cross, they keep the DNA, and her possible future would be a way to take that and form a link between the parents and this, so that they get to know that unfortunately their loved one is deceased. That's very sad, very much, but at least it gives the family closures. For her work and where she works, this is the most, this would be a very useful tool for her. But we have other things. People want buses that are always running, it like learning on buses. I wanted rural economy. There's many, many things about what we can imagine. So I come from a village in Lesotho, and I was like, wouldn't it be so great if we could just build for the village, keep it small, keep it local. But what you're trying to do is highlight all of the products and all the food that's already in the village so that you don't need to go to the shop. You can just buy from your neighbor. That's my possible future. Teeny little piece of the world. Um, and that's the end. Thank you so much. That's all I wanted to share with you. And I have 4 minutes less than the hour. I was really trying to make sure I do not take the entire hour, because I really hope to have a conversation with you all.
Okay, thank you so much. This was really fascinating. A great tour of all your work. We can open it up to questions either online or in person, and we have a little bit of time to discuss.
Okay. Thank you. Can you guys zoom from here? Or
I can
good?
hear. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. This talk was great. Thank you so much for presenting all this work. I have a question on the access part of the work. So on the first half of the talk, you spent a lot of time talking about creating a data set of the townships and how you classified, and you had to use a lot of your knowledge of how the community was built and how you created a data set of townships and its classifications. And my question is whether you found that you had to do something similar to the data set, for example, of hospitals that you used to compute access to. Because yeah, I'm just curious where that data set originally come from and whether there was a standardized version of the data set of all hospitals in South Africa. Did it have the information that you needed, which was beds? I see by your face nodding that you had to do a lot of work to get
Yeah.
that to the stage that you used. So I'm curious, yeah, how was that process and what did you do to that data?
Oh, yeah, that was a lengthy process. It starts off, there are some communities of research, not of research, there are some communities which keep track of the hospitals. Many of them are built by the private hospitals themselves. There's some provinces that are very good with like having just online documentation. There's this province called KwaZulu-Natal, which is on the eastern coast. It's very good. So there we could find data online. We could, things were reliable. So there was a lot of scraping, just web resources, whatever was there was documented. Then from there, there was a thing of making sure that we can geolocate it appropriately, getting like that georeferencing. And then, of course, there was the thing of making sure it's open that required a lot of Google search, and sometimes that required a phone call. I have a feeling the government of health, the Department of Health, has quite maybe a number of this data, but we were not privy to it. And so, we built the data set. I mean, I would think that they do have it. I don't know if they would have it geo-referenced and all of that. But it was a lot of work, but also, like I said, we kind of had an idea about what we were doing, right? Like um we kind of had an idea about like where we would be expecting specific things. So, and also, we're here locally. If we're just calling locally, we can speak the languages, many of the languages that people speak. So that helps a great deal.
Thank you.
And I do have to say, there's something that I learned when I was working at the CSIR about how to approach people, right? And one of the things is that you need to like if you want specific data sets, sometimes it helps a great deal to approach people who are working on the specific, like not necessarily the higher up, right? Like not the department heads and all of that, but like people who are kind of like on your same level. So we did have some of the people that, you know, who were affiliated with, you know, health and health access that were kind of like researchers like us and provide us like pointers.
Hi, thanks for your talk. It was great. What aspects of augmenting data to create usable tools in these contexts can also create risk for marginalized groups that exist in the long tail? And I was wondering if you had thoughts about this trade-off and generally how these data sets and the tools developed around them can be held in trust by communities.
That is such a great question. And I have to say that that is one of the reasons why I am inclined to trust the people who build for their communities. Anytime you build a product that requires any form of aggregation, which is what data collection is, you are exposing specific people to risk. And AI systems are very surveillance, right? Like they're very based on surveillance. So yes, we worry about that. We worry about misinterpretation. We worry about yes, we worry about privacy. Um, this, of course, this is a great venue to discuss this because there are some economic related concepts to this, right? This is about these people are going to trust us that we're going to act in their best interest, right? So that's the principal Asian problem, and I know like there's been some people actually who have started to write about this kind of thing, like, okay, how do we ameliorate these possible harms that can come out? And they're using, for example, social choice theory in order to be able to do this. These are very, very difficult problem. For me, I believe that if you decrease the distance between the user and the developer, you're hopefully going to get somewhere. But that does not mean that we should not be held accountable for the errors that we do make. One of the things we were very sensitive to in building this data set is that because informal settlements are not legal settlements, sometimes governments do and they just raise them over, and these homes are destroyed. So us identifying that this is an informal settlement and it's located here can put those people at risk. And so one of the things we do is we do not release the data at those kinds of granularity and based on like the person who's requesting it. And really, actually, what has that meant is that we have not released this data a lot because we are looking for a home for this kind of data set, given its sensitivity. And another example, way back, we were looking at like student protest. And this actually is another place where I started to realize the power of aggregation that you now bring. We're working on a project. There was a big protest in South Africa called Fees Must Fall. It was after there was a university fee hike for the public universities. And we got stuck with this network neighborhood where you could specifically pinpoint who are the people, you know, the core of this, right? Like on a network and be able to see, oh, these are the people who are really like disseminating the most active nodes here. And one of the things that we did do was that we destroyed that data set. It wasn't worth it, especially because that protest was getting highly policed. For us, and where we were in our beliefs, we decided that we actually do not, because also we still work for the government, right? It's a government research lab. We didn't want to be in a place where we've got this data set, given that now there was getting, the students were being policed. So there's always risk, and then you decide what you're going to do with it.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Hi, can you hear me or see me?
I can hear you. I can't see you. I would love to see you.
Okay. All right. Yeah, thanks so much for your fascinating work. I have a few questions. I'm also actually developing a semantic segmentation model to detect like unpaved roads or, huts, particularly for African landscape. And as an individual researcher in my team, it takes so many years to do this job. And I'm wondering if you see this kind of work, local work, can be scaled up by individual researchers. And another question is, you mentioned that nighttime light prediction was misleading in particularly South African context, where there are streets heavily guarded by police, and those areas were not necessarily high income. But they shine brightly at night. I'm wondering if this prediction, if this kind of local specificity lower the overall prediction accuracy, like average prediction accuracy, or would it be just lowering, would it be just increasing variance in error in particular area? And also, like, you emphasize local specific training, and I'm totally with you. I'm also using community-led prediction models. But at the same time, if we only look at local, there is limited training data and maybe limited spatial variation, which would maybe decrease accuracy in your prediction. So, would, fine tuning, like you can start with national, regional, global model, and, fine tuning that model to your local area be a solution for that? Lastly, you talked about neighborhood boundaries, and I'm very interested in that. How did you set those boundaries? Is it administrative boundaries, or have you looked at zonal statistics, like planning documents? Or you also mentioned like unsettlement areas, which might not be, formal, which might not have formal boundaries. So did you look at roads or how people like engage with each other? So just getting to know more about how you set those boundaries would be interesting.
Wow. Okay, that's a lot. Thank you. And you see, this is why you should be there in person. Then we could just have sat down over coffee. All right, let me see. I will just take them randomly here. I've written some. Fine-tuning. Yes, of course. If it makes sense, yes, of course. Some of the people that I talk about, for example, who builds language technology here, they'll use like a specific architecture. The question is going to be that you can't fine-tuning itself, right? We know that it's a science of it on its own, right? Like how far do you fine-tune, right? How shallow, how deep do you go, right? And also what do you leave? How far, like, what do you leave inside the model? One of the things that I've observed with how language technology has been built in Africa is that many of them actually will take the architecture, right? They'll take let's say a bird, right? They'll take a specific architecture and then they'll actually train it, but only with languages that are in the same language family, right? So it's still going to be, or they'll like pick like languages that were first of all trained somewhere in languages that are closer to the language family, right? Because the idea of fine tuning is not just neutral, right? What you started off with, right? We do have this thing called, what is it called? Like negative transfer, right? Like when you're doing like cross-lingual transfer, right? You can have a negative transfer. And so you want to make sure that you're doing it in the right way. And usually the people, if you understand the structure of the language, then you know which are your related languages that you can co-train with in order to increase data and yes, do all of that, right? Let's see, neighborhood boundaries. Yes, we did use some zoning and some land planning. Like we got stuff from like planning, and so yes, they did have some demarcations, but we also used a thing like just detecting on buildings, so building detection, and then at the end of that just like draw a boundary around, so you blob it out, right, in order to like create like a boundary for those, and those would be like some of the things that you would do for the informal settlements. Night vision. I brought that up because, yes, I'm talking about the specific area. It works in many areas. I spoke about the specific area because I was talking to the point of understanding where it is applicable, where specific measurement or metric is applicable, and where it might not, and how the decision of what metric is applicable and not might depend on your understanding of the context and the domain of the place. What have I left out? Scaling up. I think the scaling up is very related to the fine tuning. The reason why I have also started doing this kind of like a builders cooperative is also because together people actually do share resources, right? There's an issue of it's not just data, there's also compute, right? How do I make sure I have enough compute to do this? Hinuku, for example, is built on this premise of saying that we are all such small entities and we want to make sure that we do well, but we also need like these resources, and so they share these resources. But about the thing of like, I need to have, you don't need more diversity than the problem you're trying to solve, right? So you don't need things that don't exist in your world, because unless you are maybe like doing like some kind of contrastive training, right? Where you specifically want to make sure that you are like, my world is fully here. So sure, yeah, you can do that. But in general, if I'm doing a thing of like trying to classify skin diseases, I collect data on skin diseases. So yes, but sometimes you don't need to worry too much. You just need to make sure that you have coverage of the problem you're trying to solve. I think I've got to all of them.
Okay. Unless we have other questions, I think we are free to do our coffee break, and thank Nyalleng one more time for a wonderful kickoff to EMO 25.